Hey guys, Joe Garth here, creator of Brushify.io. Welcome to another episode of Brushify Bootcamp. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about landscape sculpting, and I'm going to be showing you how to use Brushify's alpha brushes to sculpt the Unreal Engine 4 terrain. I'll also be showing you some of the Unreal Engine 4 native sculpting tools, which will let you create your own levels. So, let's get started. All of these features can be used to sculpt any of the Brushify landscapes that are currently available on the Unreal Engine marketplace. So all of the landscapes that you see here can be sculpted and manipulated using these same exact methods. So this is the scene that we got to last time. We were painting some sort of puddles down and creating some sort of variations in roughness on the terrain, and just sort of showing how the texture workflow could be, in Brushify, swapping out these textures that you get. Any textures that you get with Brushify with these sort of custom Megascans textures. So if you want to see that stuff, go to the previous videos. From this video, I'm just going to start off by completely flattening this terrain and pretty much starting from scratch. I'm going to go to the paint layer. So if I go to modes, landscape, paint, and then I'm just going to fill the whole thing with grass. And then I'm going to go to the sculpt menu, and I'm going to go down from the sculpt tool. I'm going to go to the flatten tool, and I'm just going to flatten everything. I'm going to go through each of these tools later just to explain how all this works. But yeah, just for now, just want to revert this landscape back to its defaults. So I've just got a couple of rocks here. I'm just going to click and delete. And now I have pretty much delete the mannequin as well. Now I have pretty much just a completely flat, grassy plain. You can see if I get close, I've got these grass, little nice grassy sort of clovers and little flowers and stuff that kind of grow automatically. And as I move away, those all disappear. That's something that's completely generated by the grass layer, the grass types system. So you don't need to worry about that. That'll all be handled automatically. So I'm just going to save this level as a new version. I'm just going to call this Brushify Bootcamp, maybe version 2, so that I've got the old version available to me as well. And it's just going to reset the camera, and there we go. So yeah, this is pretty much just a Brushify terrain. Just an Unreal Engine landscape with the Brushify auto material applied to it. And you can see that I'm able to just move my camera speed down a little bit. You can see that I'm able to fill the whole thing with grass. So yeah, from here, you will see that I've got a bit of tiling going on this terrain. And I don't necessarily want that to be the case. Now, there are a couple ways that we can fix that. One way is to simply go to the landscape painting menu, and just like we did before, we can paint down a number of different layers. So if I take a variation, maybe forest, I'm just going to give that a layer info. There should usually be some layer infos that are already created. So in the materials landscapes layer infos folder, you can choose one of those and just assign that. And then from here, I can sort of go in and start painting a little bit of a variation to the texture. And as long as you keep the sort of number variance quite low, you can usually do this quite cheaply. But yeah, so this is just a very simple blend of two layers. Now you'll notice that there's still some repetition going on. Now, if I want to get rid of that even further, I can come into my landscape entity, just click on the landscape entity, and then go to the details panel right here. And if you scroll down that until you get to landscape material, and just open the landscape material by clicking the little magnifying glass, and it'll open up in the content browser. From there, you can open up the actual material instance. Now, the material instance is a place where we can actually tweak quite a lot of the settings for the textures. So I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. And on the right, you can see the landscape. And then here on the left, we can actually see all of the different parameters for distance tiling. So that's right here. You should be able to see at the very top, it says Brushify Landscape Auto Material. We've got a few different categories. We've got cover layer, distance tiling, flow maps, PBR, procedural. And all of these are just sort of doing different functions. They're different functions within this landscape auto material. So I'm going to go and tweak the setting called global tiling. And that's really the texture level of detail at a global distance. So what that means is when I zoom in, if I zoom in on this terrain, you can see that the textures start to shift. So at a very, very close level, you can see like rocks and pebbles and grass on the floor. Then if I start to zoom out, that sort of fades into a slightly different, sort of more macro texture. And that macro texture is actually a completely different texture. And then if I zoom out even further, that texture then blends once more into an even more zoomed out version of that macro texture. So what we're doing by changing this parameter right here, let me just do that now, is we're actually changing the amount that global texture level of detail tiles. So this is at how much tiling that really has. So, if I make it really, really, so it doesn't tile at all, it's going to get super, super blurry because it's barely tiling. But then if I increase that, you start to see I get more detail, but then of course it's tiling more. So really what you've got to do is try and find a balance here for your terrain and the sort of size of your terrain in this setting, and try and find a sort of compromise of looks and sort of quality that looks good at all distances and all angles. So I think this one works pretty well for my terrain. There is still a little bit of tiling. Maybe we can turn it down a little bit more. It really boils down to how much you can kind of get away with, in using as little tiling as possible, but still trying to maintain, a good look. So eventually, when you turn the tiling too far down, it's going to get blurry. But yeah, so I think this looks a lot better, and I'll just revert it back to the default so you can see the difference. So that's the default, tons of tiling going on there. If I just halve it, then we've got a much better result. Now, you might be asking, why don't I just make that the default? The reason for that is that out of the box, when you build Unreal Engine landscapes, they're always going to be a different size and a different scale. So depending on the scale of the landscape that you've created, different tiling settings will look good. So the only way that you can really make sure that you have the right tiling setting is to make sure that you eyeball it and make a custom value for the scale of your terrain. Now, when it comes to macro tiling, it's a little less necessary to tweak that one. I usually find it works pretty well out of the box because at a certain distance, it's kind of relative to relative to the player. But if you want to tweak that one as well, you can. You've got macro tiling right here, and you can see how that changes based on the value that I input. But I'm just going to leave that on the default 0.04. So yeah, and now you can see that I've got a pretty decent sort of blending terrain. There aren't too many too much tiling. There's not too much tiling going on. And what I have actually done is I've changed that setting in the default material instance. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to build your own version of this material instance. So I'm going to go into this Brushify Bootcamp maps folder, and I'm going to make a material override. Now the material override, I'm going to basically go into the materials landscape folder and take that MI landscape that's assigned to this, and I'm just going to make a copy of that in that material override folder. And then this one, I'm then going to assign directly to my landscape. So this is now basically a slightly modified version, a very slightly modified version of that material instance that we can then use to basically store all of our custom settings. So I'm just going to save that, right click, save. And now we have the global tiling set to 0.06, which is what we want. And we've got now this nice little custom material instance in our maps folder. So now I think we're in a really great position to sort of start sculpting the terrain. And I'm going to show you some of the sort of sculpting tools. And we're going to see how that goes. So the first thing we're going to do to start sculpting this terrain, now that we've got no tiling, the textures are kind of, we've got a few variations painted there, we're going to go to the landscape tool. So modes panel, landscape tool. If you can't find the modes panel, just go up to window and go modes to open the modes tab. And if I just close that, window, modes, you'll see it open right here. And usually what I do is put it right here on the right side, just so that I get quite a lot of space, and then I have a nice big window here. And usually just put the details panel a little bit lower, right down here, because I don't usually need to see that entire details panel. I can kind of scroll it up and scroll it down. I just think this is quite a nice layout. So yeah, so this is the landscape tab. I'm going to go to sculpt, and we're just going to go through all of these options, sort of explaining what they do. So the very first option right at the top is sculpt height data. And you can see that as I start to sculpt with the height data sculpting brush, it's making these sort of big blobs on the terrain. And yeah, the Brushify Auto Material does a pretty cool job of kind of making my blobs look not too terrible. It's got some sort of details going on, and in fact, I can actually start running around on this now, since this is all real time. And you can see it's blended nicely into this sort of cliff wall look. But really, these mountains aren't exactly impressing anyone. There's not too much detail there. I can run to the top of this one here and look around. So yeah, big blobs, not exactly what we're looking for most of the time. It might be the style of your game. If that's what you want, then you can create big blobs. So what if we want to make these blobs smaller? Well, we've got the brush size parameter right here, and we can actually turn that down. And if you can see the little as you go off to the side here and leave your brush somewhere, you'll be able to see that brush increase and decrease in size. So you can see that happening right now. And I turn this brush size down, you're gonna get a smaller brush. Now you've got smaller blobs, and then even smaller than that, really small blobs. So now you can see I'm sort of painting in, more detail. And well, this is maybe not the most impressive sculpting work I've ever done, but you can see how you can start to sort of get somewhere on a sort of small, low level of detail with just using the sort of sculpting brushes to sort of manufacture some nice, interesting landscape shapes. So yeah, and now let's go in again and sort of start running around. So yeah, same thing again, but a bit more detail. We've got a few more little variations going on in our landscape now. So that's really the sculpting brush without any, bells and whistles. You've got a couple more parameters here. One is the brush fall off, and if you can see that I'm going to make my brush size a little bigger so you can really see it. But if I move that sculpting brush to the side and change the brush fall off, you can see that it's changing this sort of fall off. It's very much like Photoshop. It's changing the sort of alpha fall off of the brush. And you can make it really, really sharp. So if we make it really, really sharp, you can see that it's going to create a stamp, like a sort of, very hard circle. Let's get a bit of terrain where there's nothing going on. And let's kind of stamp that. And you can see that now it's created this ridiculously hard edge, which, maybe that is something useful. I'm going to show you later how you can create sort of flatten areas. So if these sort of floating islands type things are, what you're interested in creating, you can do that. And then again, size tool, you can change the size. And this is painting now without any fall off. So let's go and run around a little bit on there. You can really see the terrain resolution is really starting to show when you use these very, very hard edges, because there is not enough resolution in the landscape itself to really support that kind of detail. But yeah, we can sort of run around and jump around on these big canyons we've just created, but they don't look especially amazing. The other thing you'll notice is that if you do have cliff walls like this that are super flat, there is no triplanar mapping on most auto materials. And the reason for that is that it's a very expensive feature. So if I explain a little bit what triplanar mapping is, it would be if you would take this texture and then instead of projecting it from above, you would in fact project it from the side. Now, that's something that most games try to avoid because it's adding a lot more shader complexity to this shader. So if we go to our shader overdraw view, we can see that, already we have some, we're already in the brown sort of area, and we don't want to go much further into that. We can actually make that a little bit better by tweaking some settings in our material instance, a little custom material instance. For instance, we could disable cover. Another thing we could do is fill entirely with a single paint layer. That would help a lot with the shader complexity. But I'm definitely going to be doing another tutorial. Yeah, so if I disable cover, you can see that I've now got much more performance here. But of course, that does come at the sacrifice of not being able to have a cover layer, which would be the snow layer. In this scene, I don't have any snow, so it's not necessary. I'll definitely be doing an optimization tutorial in the future where I talk about, all the various things that you can do, to disable and sort of fix some things. So what if we would want to get rid of this stretching here? Well, the best possible way that I would say to get rid of and sort of remove these sort of stretching is that you would create then mesh. You'd use meshes to cover up these sort of vertical slopes, or you would sort of smooth out the terrain. So I'm going to show you the next tool, which is the smooth tool. And in all of these tools, you'll notice there's a parameter called tool strength. And we can just kind of tweak that tool strength and leave the rest of them on their default settings. If you ever want to switch to default, just use the little reset to default arrow. And then if I just slowly let's move the radius down a bit, slowly sort of click there, you can see that things start to get a little bit better the moment that the terrain isn't quite vertical, which looks more impressive, I think. The other thing that we can do then is, of course, slot in a few nice little meshes, which is the usual way that you would do this. Take maybe one of the meshes from the mesh folder. So if you go in Brushify meshes, cliffs, meshes, you will find some of these sort of general purpose cliff meshes that you can use. So this one's a nice big sort of rock. Let's see if we can put this one to good use. So something like that. Always make sure, if you want to make some cool variations, just rotate things around and make sure things look a bit different. You never want anything to look too similar. Otherwise you will lose that organic feeling. And don't forget to don't be afraid to sort of pile rocks on top of each other and all that kind of stuff. Smaller the assets are, the more the easier they're going to be to sort of hold up. You'll be able to sort of get closer to them because you won't have to worry about the textures not holding up at a close distance. So if you can ever scale things down, by all means do that. But yeah, you can see how you would start to sort of gradually build a little scene here. And this is just putting a bit of time in. Of course, there are other ways you can scatter rocks, and we'll be addressing that later, which is, stuff like using the procedural spawning tools for things like cliffs, which are also very, very handy. And obviously you don't want to be doing everything by hand because it's a very slow process. Yeah, so just going to keep putting a few of these in there until we have... I mean, these aren't actually the best asset. This isn't actually the best asset I've got for this kind of thing. This is actually just a little rock. It's not really meant to be for cliffs. But yeah, it's just one I found in my library. If you get Brushify, you'll get a bunch of these different assets, you know, different things that you can use. And I'm gonna throw a bunch of those in my tutorial folder later, so that I've got access to those. Just using this one for now because I don't actually have all of the different Brushify projects loaded into the Bootcamp project file at the moment. But yeah, so you can sort of see how you would create kind of convincing cliff walls and sort of cover up that vertical stretching on the terrain. And yeah, that's generally how it's done. In most games, if you look at the terrain, it's usually not using that many sort of fancy shader tricks. It's usually a combination of, you know, nice clean geometry, not too much verticality on the actual terrain itself. Usually the terrain is quite smooth, and then just covered up by, you know, anything that needs to be an overhang. That's the great thing about meshes as well, is this can actually be an overhang here. You couldn't do that if it was just terrain. You know, now it looks way more interesting that we can have this sort of looming, overhanging cliff. You know, imagine how crazy that must be if you're a player, you're running through and you see this big, overhanging, scary, looming cliff. And that only gets better when you have stuff like fog and, you know, all of the sort of visual effects adding to, you know, sort of epic scene like this. So yeah, that's just a very quick demonstration of the sort of, yeah, if you just decide to paint these kind of crazy islands with no fall off. I'm just going to delete all of this that I've done now. Just going to delete all of these little cliffs that I've made. And we'll start from scratch again, I think. Flatten Tool. I'll go over this one in a second. I just want to reset. Reset. Go back to the drawing board. Okay. Delete this stray rock. So, where do we get to? So we've got through the sculpting tool. Where do we go to? The brush fall off. So yeah, brush fall off. That's how you get that sort of very hard edge like that. But you know, that's up to you. I think a little bit of an edge is always better. And then to use meshes is a good way to kind of cover up the vertical stretching on the terrain. That's how I do it. And yeah, let's see. Now you've also got this parameter, use clay brush. Now this is it's slightly more advanced option. I think it's actually affecting the way that the brush additively sculpts the terrain. So it's the sort of, in Photoshop, I think it's more equivalent to sort of additive blend, if that makes any sense to you, if you're coming from sort of a digital painting background. But really, you know, I can try and describe it and use my words, but the best way is just to see what it does, and then you will hopefully understand what using a clay brush does. For it to really work and be more sort of obvious, we need to actually use an alpha brush. To do that, we need to go to, make sure you're in the sculpt mode, sculpt tool, and instead of circle, I'm going to choose alpha. Now, a bunch of different options here, but alpha I'm going to go over first, so I think it's the most important. And now I've selected alpha, you'll see that there's actually a little menu here. You've got, again, tool strength and all that stuff. But right here, we've got something called brush settings. And in mine, I've already got a texture that's added there. And this texture is actually, if I hit the little magnifying glass, so yeah, you can see that I've actually got the Brushify Erosion alpha brush texture applied. If I just hit the little magnifying glass, you can see that's because I've got a few sort of installed Brushify packs. So if you come to Brushify alpha brushes folder, you'll be able to find all of the different alpha brushes for the packs. Now, there's a bit of confusion about this because there is one pack that I sell which does not include an alpha brush. So I'm just going to come over here and make this a bit bigger. So this is the actual website, www.brushify.io. You can actually buy the packs through Unreal Engine Marketplace. But I like to just put, you know, a nice website here that everyone can kind of understand what the product's all about. And these are a few of the scenes from the various packs. So yeah, sculpt, generate, play. That's what I'll be showing a bit in this video. Just how easy it is to, create little landscapes and then run around on them. But yeah, if you come down to Get Brushify Now and hit Visit the Store, and here you can see all of the different Brushify packs that are currently available. Now, if you buy almost any of these packs, you're going to get alpha brushes included. The only packs that do not include alpha brushes are the Environment Shaders pack, which is the cheapest pack. So quite a lot of you guys have that. It was given away for free. And the Country Roads pack and the Natural Roads pack. Yep, here. So if you have Country Roads pack, Natural Roads pack, or Environment Shaders pack, unfortunately, those do not come with alpha brushes. So if you would like the alpha brushes, be sure to purchase one of the other packs, the sort of biome packs that include them. So if we come to the Arctic pack, this one was actually given away for free. This one actually says right here, includes 4 unique Arctic terrain brushes as pictured above. And then if you scroll up and you actually go to the screenshots, you can see right here, these are actually 3D renders of those alpha brushes. And the interesting thing is that all of the alpha brushes in Brushify come with both 3D meshes, like these, for the sort of distant backgrounds, as well as actual alpha brushes for use in the sculpting tools right here. So you can actually see this is the one for Arctic, this file right here, Brushify Arctic A, that means alpha. And if I drag and drop that over into my texture slot, just got to give it a second. It usually has to compile some stuff because it's 8K texture. These are very, very high resolution. And, quite a lot of people ask me, why do I charge so much for, for these brushes? And sort of trying to figure out, like, what makes these sort of packs worth the money. And that's really because these brushes, they take a lot of time and effort to generate, They aren't that simple to sort of produce. They're definitely not the kind of thing that you usually find on the marketplace that's sort of ready-made. They've got an example scene that's already out of the box looking good with all the lighting. You get all the shaders, you get all of the stuff with it in the box. It's all set up for you. Out of the box, it's all set up for you. And the brushes don't just come as meshes, they also come as sculpting brushes for the terrain tool. And I'll show you the sort of power of those right now. Once we've dragged across the brush into the texture slot, we've then got a few other options here. The first option is texture channel. This is very important because you'll notice that we've only got one file here, but like I said before, there are actually 4 brushes. To access those 4 brushes, they are actually in the texture channels of that file. So you don't just get one brush, you're actually getting 4 brushes in that file. And you can switch between red, green, and you can see here the image updating, blue, and alpha. So these different texture channels change the image that is being brushed down, basically. Now the brush size is just the same as the other function, so I'm going to make this a little bigger so we can really see the brush and the sort of effect that it has. And if we start painting straight away, if I set the tool strength quite high, like 5 or something, and we click, you can see that something is happening. It's definitely making an effect. But you've got this kind of weird thing where it's sort of cumulatively adding. It maybe isn't very useful because it's gonna go like that and just whoa, it's you don't really have much control over it unless you really just click once. A better mode is to sort of use this clay brush mode and then just click once. And then you'll get a much more sort of accurate result. So just click. I made the tool strength a little higher. But now you can see that we're actually getting tons and tons and tons of little details in just one click. I didn't have to really do anything for it to generate all that detail. We can also rotate the brush around using the texture rotation function here. That's usually good if we just go over here a little bit. We can see that as I rotate that around, that big square is moving. And then click, and there we go. So now we can already, once we've clicked down like that, we can already start to run around on our newly sculpted terrain, which I think is really cool because it's a very fast way to generate huge amounts of terrain and landscapes, you know, without having to do very much work at all. Obviously, there are some issues with this. There is still a bit of blockiness going on in the landscape, but I'll teach you how to sort of deal with that later. But generally, it's really cool to have all these extra details, like this little, I don't know what you call it, like a little bluff here. You know, it can really inspire you with your level design, you know, to add extra features to your levels that you maybe wouldn't necessarily have thought of. You know, like imagine if you'd had to go and sort of sculpt every little bluff here and every little ridge, every little, you know, you would take hours and hours and hours, and you maybe wouldn't be able to get such a natural result, you know, something like this. Let's try a different sculpting brush. I'm going to switch from red to green. And I'm just going to rotate that around a bit. And yeah, same thing. Just click. So yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. I'm just going to try a different area. So yeah, same thing again. You know, you can just go around your entire map and, you know, tweak your tool strength a little bit. Click. Oh, it didn't really do very much. Maybe increase it a little bit more. Click. Oh wow, that looks good. And then, you know, if you like the look of something, you can keep it. If you don't like it, Control Z, alter the tool strength a bit, tweak a bit the rotation, click. And you know, you can see how you start to gradually get interesting landscapes out of this tool. And this is all done without any need to go into a third-party application like World Creator. Now, this is a very, very, very small, you know, or World Creator or World Machine. Now, that's not to say those aren't super useful programs. I've actually got a video called Make a Level in 1 Hour that uses World Creator, and it's using this technique in combination with World Creator to build, you know, a nice big island terrain. But you can see how this is really cool because it lets you sort of edit and sculpt in real time and, you know, kind of get results right then and there that, you know, on a sort of smaller scale. You know, so maybe you use World Creator or World Machine to build these sort of larger mountains, but now you're really thinking about the sort of canyons and the sort of corridors of the level, the, you know, the places where the player is actually going to be walking around, and you want to really build some detail in. So you've got all of these different options. You know, you can create some large, you know, hills and mountains and things in the game, in the engine, without having to go back to World Creator and completely overhaul and change everything. It's where it's much harder to make these sort of little changes. And then, of course, you know, you can use, you know, in addition to this, then you can go back to the normal sculpting tools. And then if you really want to make microscopic changes, you've then got the normal sculpting tools that you can, you know, go in there and really modify. Oh, my tool strength is very high. I'm going to turn off clay brush and tool strength. But yeah, just there you can go in and, oh wow, now I've actually got complete control over all the little details, all of the aspects of the terrain. I can model around a bit, sculpt around a bit, you know, and make some very, very detailed areas. And this comes in handy as well with the Flatten Tool, which is going to be one of the next things I'm going to show you. But first, I'm going to teach you how to use the Smoothing Tool because it's next on the list. And the reason why I'm going to teach you how to use the Smoothing Tool is because this terrain looks really cool and detailed from a distance, but when you get very close, you start to notice that there are some big sort of problems with the actual geometry. It's all a little bit blocky. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the Smooth Tool. There are a bunch of different options here. You've got, again, tool strength, which I'm going to set really, really far down because I don't want to do very much to this. And then there's a few options for, it's called filter kernel radius. But this, I would sort of treat this as, you know, whether it's a parameter that defines whether or not you will smooth out bigger details or whether you will sort of smooth out smaller details. So in this case, we actually don't want to smooth out the big details. We want to smooth out smaller details. So we've got actually a sort of between 1 and 7. The slider goes between 1 and 7. 1 being the one that smooths out only smaller details, 7 being the one that smooths out the big details. So if we moved up to 7 and then sculpt, we'll be able to see that it's sort of killing. I'm going to set the size and fall off back to the default, it's going to start to kill some of the big details. Whoa, I've lost all my sculpting amazing detail there, so that's not good. Control Z. But then if I go down to 1, hey, you can see that I've still maintained some of the little bluffs and ridges and things like that. So maybe I don't necessarily want it to be as smooth as that, but so let's just revert. But yeah, you can see that there's definitely it's a good thing to basically turn that down. The other thing you can do is enable detail smooth. This is a similar parameter to the filter kernel radius, but even more detail. So larger detailed smoothing values remove more details, while smaller values preserve more details. So if we want ours to be lower, because we want to preserve more details, and we're going to enable detail smooth and then preserve, and then we're just going to click. And you can see that now it's even more details that are being preserved, but the overall terrain is now looking so much more smooth. You can really see that in the wireframe, as I've kind of tweaked it, which I think is really cool. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep the tool strength at 1. I'm going to set the brush size, though, to something ridiculously huge, so it covers my entire map. And then I'm just going to click maybe once. Okay, it's a little bit smoother, and then again a little bit smoother again, and this is affecting the entire map now. So I think 3 times. Let's have a look around. We can inspect areas and just see, do we see any of that horrible blockiness anymore? Okay, so now we have a nice sort of smooth terrain. We've got lots of cool little details going on. Got the sort of grass appearing on the paint layer as automatically, and all of the all of the sort of sharp edges are sort of smoothed out now. I'm just kind of putting the camera really close to the ground so I can really look at the sharp edges. But they're definitely not as bad as they were before, not as noticeable. And that looks great. So yeah, that's the smoothing tool. That's how you can use that to, sort of generate. You can use the sculpting tool to generate alpha. Use the alpha brushes to generate terrains really fast, and then you can use the smoothing tool to make sure that those are sort of ready for the player to run around with. To run around on, without them sort of becoming too sort of lumpy and low res. I say that, but there's a bit here that's a bit too spiky. If you ever do get a sort of spiky bit, you can just go in and take the brush size down, way down, and then just click a few times to smooth it out. Some bits naturally are a bit spikier. And worst case scenario, if you found like a bit that you really want to keep, you can supplement it with geometry. So if you feel like that bit's a bit too spiky, and you really want to add a bit more detail there that looks good and not just a bit of terrain or something, yeah, why not go into your content browser and pull out a nice little asset that you can use to kind of supplement that that little piece of terrain. So this might not be the perfect example, but something like that, where now we've got something that really adds a little bit of real detail. And you can go crazy with this. Like every single part of your level, you need to take and find assets and then use them to build interesting shapes, interesting designs to sort of supplement your mountains. And let's see if we can do that here. Just gonna rotate this around and then and this is all just a case of slotting assets into the mountains. So now you can see that we've got a much more realistic looking mountain there, or little ridge that looks like something that that could be from a game rather than just a blob of terrain. And the procedural tools help a lot with this, which I'll definitely be going over in a future video. But yeah, you can see how placing by hand is always If you really want that amazing detail, that's the best way to do it. Just place by hand and add a bit of supplemental detail that way. Okay, so next tool on the agenda, we go back to the landscape, and we're going to go to the Flatten tool. So sculpt, smooth, next one, flatten. So Flatten tool is essentially a way of flattening your terrain. So we've got a few options here. At the moment, there's a little thing ticked here called right at the top called Flatten Target. So we're going to disable that, and we're going to show you what it does without that. I'm just going to revert all these to the basic values. Now, if I click, whoa, it's flattened out the terrain where I've clicked. And it's the same thing if I click here. Oh, now it's flattened out there. So that's really what this does. It sort of flattens out at different height, at the height that you click at, it makes a little flattened area. And of course you can change the brush size as usual, and we can build these sort of little platforms that way. And you know, these could be, well, you know, if you imagine whatever game you're building, it could be a platforming game. You can just run in here and let's show that. So woo, we're jumping down the little platforms all the way down to the bottom. And well, if that's the kind of game you're making, it's a great tool for that. But yeah, same thing as before with the stretch terrain. Use meshes to cover that up, or use your smoothing tool to just quickly. Oh, we've got all of the settings we had before. I'm just going to revert those. But yeah, use the smoothing tool to, you know, kind of smooth out a little bit that those super vertical walls, if those are an eyesore for you. Or just cover them up with meshes, and so on and so forth. And you know, if you do really need triplanar mapping, it is something that is possible in Unreal Engine. It's just quite a bit more expensive, so bear that in mind. Brushify is very flexible. You know, it's a shader. It's using the shader infrastructure of Unreal Engine. So if you do want to build your own features in on top of this, you definitely can. And it's actually quite, you know, it's set up very logically with material functions for all the different sort of purposes. You know, there's functions where all the layers are sort of blended together. There are functions for tessellation, object blending, tiling and distance. All of that stuff is sort of separated out into very clean, logical material functions, and then a sort of main landscape material as well that, you know, has quite a lot of information in there. It's quite a lot of it is commented as well, and I do have, you know, quite a few videos here on YouTube sort of explaining some of the various things. And that's also the purpose of this Brushify Bootcamp series, is to kind of go over and show you guys, you know, behind the scenes how you can go in and make these sort of changes. But yeah, in this tutorial I just want to focus 100% on landscape sculpting because it's a very big topic and there's a lot to it. So yeah, so there's that's the Flatten tool. And of course you can take this to the next level. Just gonna go back to Flatten. You can take this to the next level. Instead of basically flattening to the point that you are selecting, you can actually pick a custom target. So here we're going to use the eyedropper, this little dropper right here, and we're going to pick a point of the terrain that we want to sculpt to. So let's just choose the very highest point here and say we want to make a platform. Well, maybe let's choose here. Yeah, and then we'll say we want to make a platform that the player could jump to. Oh, just usually it's better to sort of sculpt straight from downward, because otherwise you might accidentally sort of, there's this problem that when you start sculpting, it kind of sculpts forward like this, and then you'll end up with something like that. That's not really what you want. So usually better to sort of sculpt looking downward if you want to really get these kind of nice platforms. Or what you could do is you could change your tool strength to just be insanely high, and then you'll get something like that, you know. But yeah, so now these are sort of, you can see that every single time it's sort of sculpting and flattening to this exact height, which is really useful for creating platforms. I mean, I'm not sure how good looking these are, but you know, you can go in and sort of supplement these with geometry. And you know, here I am just playing it. My character, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna make this jump. Oh, I can. Wow. So yeah, so automatically, oh, I'm not gonna make it. Oh no, I didn't make it. Got carried away there. But yeah, so it's a great thing that you can just, you know, preview in real time and just sort of yeah, find you know, some nice some nice ways. You know, imagine this actually could look much cooler if you would do something like, you know, this maybe, like where it starts to, let's pick an eyedrop about a third of the way down, then make one like that, and then same thing, we drop it a little bit further down than that, and then like this, and then like this. And you see what we're doing now, we're just creating a sort of spiral, sort of spiraling thing going on. Now I definitely can't make these jumps, but oh boy. But yeah, let's just see how it goes. See if we can get all the way to the end. Oh my god, I jumped too far. Oh no, I didn't. I'm okay. Ooh. This is the beauty of level design in real time, though, is that you can really... Oh wow, I might actually make this. Look at these skills, guys. So yeah, I'm actually playing this little mini game that I have created now, with just the terrain. And that's the really cool thing about the Flatten Tool. It's very useful for that kind of thing. And you know, you could imagine then, you know, if this is rapid prototyping, you prototype something like that and you're like, oh cool, but then you could go in later and you could replace this with, you know, you could really dress these up. You can go in and add geometry to the side, just like we did earlier. We could make these look pretty, basically. But yeah, it's a super useful function. Now, let's see, is there anything else here that's worth going over? There's also this thing, slope flatten, and this is basically where it will flatten to an angle. So if we turn off flatten target, let's find an angle that we want to flatten to. So yeah, here you can see that this is sort of ramp, and you see what it's done. It's actually made a flat surface. It's making a flat surface on that angle where we first clicked. And yeah, same thing here. See, I've clicked on a lesser angle, so now it's made a flat angle there. But if we go on a really hard angle, whoa, now it's going to make that really hard, flat angle. So it's quite an interesting one. If you've already got a pre-existing slope and you want to really flatten it out more, it can be quite useful. But yeah, with great power comes great responsibility. So if you don't use that tool correctly, you can get some really weird results. I don't use it that often. That's a bit of a niche one. Now, another way that you can create these sort of ramps and stuff is by actually using the ramp tool. So that was the use slope flatten. But instead of flatten tool, let's go to the list again, and we'll go to the next tool, which is the ramp tool. So the ramp tool is a really great way that you can sort of add ramps up and down different surfaces. So yeah, sometimes you'll get this sort of floating geometry. If that ever happens to you, just save your level and reload or restart the editor, and that'll sort of recalculate. So now you can see it sort of recalculated all of the procedural stuff. So just save and reload the level. That is something that I get asked all the time. It's a super common issue that sometimes people will have sort of floating foliage and then write me an email. So if that is you, don't worry, you're not alone. And I've had many of those emails in the past. So yeah, back to the ramp tool. Let's go back to landscape, ramp tool. And the first thing I'm going to do is just going to click. And you can see it's made a sort of entity now. And that's something we can actually drag around with the gizmo. And then the next thing I'm going to do is click again. And that sort of made a second part. And what we've got here is a bit of a sort of spline that's forming. So the more I click, well, this one, if I click now, it will place the second one. So yeah, you click again and you'll have this sort of second entity here. So what happens if I then click add ramp? You can see it's sort of created this flat area now. Now the great thing about this tool is it's really something that can be used to create sort of roads and pathways. I'm just going to undo that one. So I'm going to click at the top, and then I'm going to click again here. But this time I'm going to turn down this ramp width. And as I turn the ramp width, you can see that it's sort of changing the, you know, if you sort of think about this as a road, it's sort of changing the width and the fall off of this road. So click add ramp. And then we can start to sort of use this, even further, which is that we can click on, if you click on one of the entities and then you click around, you're able to move that. So I'm going to click there, then I'm going to click the second entity and I'm going to move it down here, and then I'm going to click add ramp, and now we've got a nice little ramp that we are able to go up. And then same thing again, I'm going to move that one to there, move the second one to here, I'm going to move the first one to here, and you can see what I'm doing. I'm sort of creating a little road down the mountain all the way to the bottom, and we can go in, run in and sort of test that now. And we're running up our newly created road. Same thing as before. If you ever get any floating stuff like that, just oops, wrong button. Just save the level, reload the level, and 9 times out of 10 everything will get fixed up. But yeah, so I can just go in now and use the ramp that I just created and run around on it. Now, of course, I think that's a bit too narrow, that ramp. So probably it would have been better to make that a little bit bigger. But yeah, that's the essentials of the sort of ramp tool. There's not really much to that tool. It's really just a case of clicking one area, clicking one point and then another point, setting the ramp width, setting the ramp sort of side fall off, and then hitting add ramp. And there you'll get a nice, pretty ramp all the way up and down. Maybe I can use it to make a way off of here. Let's see. Let's make it down there, down here. A little ramp so that I can run up here. Hey, that's cool. Maybe I can run up there. I don't know if I made it. I don't know if I made it too steep. Oh no, you can run up. That's cool. So now we have a way up here, and I can now jump. Oh, I jumped too far on that one. I can now jump up here and then kind of play this. Failed completely. But yeah, I did it before. You saw me. I did it before. Don't judge. Yeah, so I can now run around like a little kid, continually jumping on these like it's some sort of playground. Yeah. So yeah, you can really see how you can kind of. Oh wow. You can really see how you can kind of create some little gameplay elements and stuff in addition to a sort of nice, pretty terrain. These tools are also really, really useful for that. And yeah. So what else is there? There's also this Erosion Tool, which is quite an interesting one because this one will actually sort of add some detail to your sort of quite boring terrain. So if there's any areas of the terrain that you want to add a little bit more detail to, like this area, we've kind of just flattened out these blocks. And, imagine that I actually want to make that look a bit more like, this sort of nicely eroded area here. Well, there is also the Erosion Tool. So let's change the brush size a little bit. And let's see if we can get some interesting erosion going. So I'm going to tweak the settings here. So you can see it's starting to add a little bit of extra detail. But what this does, I think, is really just like takes the information that's already there and kind of enhances it. It manipulates it. It moves up and down and kind of adds noise to it. The less you have the noise scale, the more sort of bumpy it's going to be, but you don't want to go too low with that. So noise scale is probably one of the main functions here. But yeah, with this tool, I would say, yeah, really just read the labels, play around with the settings. It's not an exact science. It's not always going to look good at a certain setting. You're going to have to figure out which settings are right for your terrain. But yeah, it's possible to get some good results with this. I think that it's never going to look quite as realistic as, something that's come from a digital elevation model image. But if at a pinch, if you just want to add some detail really quickly, the noise tool is fantastic for that. And the Brushify Ultimate Material will always, find a way of kind of making it look okay. So yeah, now we have a slightly more noisy, eroded area that's not just completely flat there. So let's do the same thing here. Can't go too crazy with it, but let's... You just don't want it to smooth out too much. That's the problem. It can get it can be very tricky to figure out this one. Let's switch it to both. Well, that's a little bit of a better setting. The problem is it does sometimes distort what you already have. Unless, I mean, you could find more precise settings, but it does sort of distort what you already have. So bear that in mind and just go very close, very carefully with it. Not to kind of ruin your flat areas or your ramps and any of that stuff. But yeah. So that's the erosion tool. There's also hydro erosion, very similar sort of tool. This will basically, add sort of more like, I guess, rain-based erosion. So like here, if I come down from this, it's going to give you sort of like insets in the terrain, which are really cool. So I think on some level it's doing some sort of, it's got some sort of erosion algorithm to it. But the problem is it's a bit tricky to sort of, to know what it's going to do until it's done it. So really just got to be like, just got to be careful when you paint it down that you don't go with some crazy high settings or something like that. And that you just kind of very carefully sculpt away. And I sometimes really like the shapes that it comes up with. Like these little canyons and insets. I think the main problem with it is just that it can be very random. So you kind of get what you're given. Sometimes you'll get areas that are kind of giving you really cool detailed results, and then other times you'll kind of paint in an area and you won't really get much. Like if I paint there, not much is going on. Paint here, not much is going on. But here, it's taking some sort of overlay or pattern and sort of applying that everywhere. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting tool. And then of course there's a sort of generic noise tool. You can change the scale. This will give you some noise. I think that's just using some sort of Voronoi noise effect. Pretty much just like the clouds or whatever in Photoshop. But that can be also a really cool way of adding detail. If you know how to paint noise in the right way, the right areas, you can get some details. But I always would say that the better solution is to stick as closely as possible to real digital elevation model data that uses, there's just something about this mountain here that looks more real because it's got these sort of real erosion lines from nature. And that's the real advantage of the alpha sculpting brushes. The next tool that I'd like to talk about is the visibility tool. This is actually used for caves. So it's actually used for sort of making holes in the terrain. So let's get a patch of ground here, like this one. And what you can actually do is you can actually paint a hole directly in the terrain. It has to do some stuff with the shader, but yeah, wow, there we go. We have a hole in the terrain. Now, of course, when people first make a hole in the terrain just like this, the first thing they ask me is, hey Joe, it's great, I've got a hole in my terrain, but why is all of this foliage here and how do I get rid of it? So yeah, to get rid of the foliage, it's actually really simple. Just go to the paint materials layer and you just go into, scroll right down to the bottom. There's a paint layer called Remove Procedural. If it doesn't have a paint layer, a layer info already, make a new one. And this is very, very important. Do not create a weight blended layer for this material, for this paint layer. Create a non-weight blended layer. And the reason that is that we don't want this to affect colors or shading in any way. I'm gonna make a new folder called layer info. And then that's a little layer info file. And that's a no weight blend layer info. Very, very important, no weight blend. And that means that as I paint down, it's actually hooked up to the shader. So it's actually removing, you can see, it's removing all of the procedural stuff. and leaving this sort of hole in the terrain completely clear. So you know, if you see all of those flowers, the rock and everything, if I click on that, that's gone. And if I hold shift, now it's back. So it's actually just a paint layer, just like any of the others. You know, if you were painting down forest here, or grass here, it would be the exact same thing. It's just that it's doing the same exact thing, but for removing foliage. Yeah, and it's super important to use the no weight blend. Now I'm going to do this by mistake, or you know, by on purpose. I'm going to do it wrong. I'm going to delete this. So just show you the issue that you get when you use a weight blended layer on this this paint layer. So if I click make a new one, and I use weight blended layer, make a new layer info, and then save it. And now I paint. Ooh, look at this. I've managed to create myself a massively black puddle of doom. That's and that's happening because it's that layer is never supposed to affect the visuals. Actually, it looks quite a cool effect. Actually, it's sort of like a complete perfect mirror. And that's actually using, of course, like the rough. It's because the roughness is set to 100%, and I think it's black. But yeah, you can see the sort of like it's affecting the different color channels. It's black color there, and the roughness is completely black, and then you know, so it's not a good look. So yeah, if you want to make sure that you don't have that issue, you just want it removing the foliage, make sure that you use non-weight blended layer, and then that will give you that will sort out that issue. So now you have a hole in the terrain, and of course, you know, once you've got the hole in the terrain, whoa, the player can fall through it. Or most of the time, what you'll be wanting to do is create some sort of a cave, or I'm going to use my special rock again. This is my lucky rock for this tutorial because I've used it like 20 times now. But yeah, let's see what happens if we try and build a cave here. I mean, the first thing I would do is I'd start by sort of, you know, I don't make many caves. I should make more caves in these videos. I'll probably do a dedicated cave tutorial at some point or something like that. You know, I did do some work back in the day in CryEngine that was trying to emulate the sort of glowworm caves in New Zealand. Let's see if I can find it. That was kind of a cool one. This is some of my old work from back in the day with CryEngine. And I actually made this into a sort of little music video and stuff, with these little lights sort of coming down in the cave, and then the cave actually had this sort of glowworms that you usually get in these sort of New Zealand cave systems. And the way this was made was it was actually just like this exact same, this was using the exact same technique, just lots and lots of little, in this case they were Megascans rocks, but yeah, lots and lots of little rocks just all peppering the side, and then I'd covered that in sort of these nice like glowing, these sort of glowing emissive glowworms, and they sort of move around a little bit. And I think it looked really cool with the bokeh effect, and so this is what you can do in real time if you just spend a long time placing rocks in the cave. So I'm hopefully I'll be able to get around to doing something like that in Unreal at one point, but yeah, this was actually done in CryEngine. But very similar workflows. So yeah, let's get back to it. So I'm gonna just start by going around the entrance. Let's make a few little. Yeah, don't be afraid to layer things up a bit. It is all possible, as long as you keep the number of objects down, or within certain limits. You can see here actually there's one little slightly interesting issue. You can see that it's saying preview shadows. Change preview shadows. If you want to get rid of that, go to show, go to visualize, and then go to preview shadows indicator and disable that. I don't even know if I can fit in this cave. Maybe So yeah, really that's how you build caves and sort of use the visibility tool. We've got all this map to explore, so why don't we go crazy? Let our hair down and find a new area. Migrate. So yeah, next step, we've got the region tools. And there are sort of 3 different tools to this. The first that I want to understand is actually the copy and paste tool. And if we can bring up the copy and paste tool, you can see it brings up a sort of gizmo, which you can move around just like any other object in Unreal. And yeah, if we can put this sort of gizmo over the top of a sort of slab of terrain, we can even see, you can see where it clips in with the terrain, so you can see what's sort of getting copied. And we're going to go copy data to gizmo. And you can see this, you can give it a nice visualization of that data. And if we now move that gizmo across, yeah, you can see that we've actually sort of transplanted that area of the terrain across. And then it's just a case of basically stamping down with the brush, where we want to sort of copy that data. So let's do that now. As I kind of click, you can see it's wherever I sculpt is taking the data underneath it as so you can see it's an exact copy. So it's really useful for like the tops of mountains, or if there's a certain ridge that you really like. So say I really like this ridge here, this little bit of a ridge there. I can copy the data there, and then say if I want to bring that ridge all the way over to the other side of the map and put the same ridge somewhere there. That's the exact same ridge. And now I paint. And there we go. Now I have that ridge. Probably you'd have to do some cleanup around. But yeah, it's the same exact ridge. And yeah, so it's quite a useful tool. Of course, it could be that there's a more specific thing for it. So for instance, over here, where we have our sort of little mini game going on, maybe this is a mini game that we like over here, but we also would like to have that same mini game at a different part of the map. And we don't want to have to redo all that work. We just want to find a way of copying our mini game from one place to another. So let's put the little game here. Change the height there a little bit. And then, yeah, we're just gonna paste in the game. All right, there we go. Now we've got that exact same game, and I can play it again, but on a different part of the map. Oh, it's crazy. It's difficult. Oh, I've made it even more difficult because I think it didn't get all of the accuracy. So there's one thing you might want to note is that it's not going to take all of the accuracy of the across in the data, so it might be a little bit less accurate. If I move that back on, let's try and just like really make sure it gets all of the strength of that stuff. But still, I think it won't be 100% accurate to the exact thing that we had before. So just be warned about that. It's just a sort of limitation of that copying the data tool. I'm not very good at that. But yeah, it's a very useful feature. So now we've got 2 little games on our map that we didn't have to do twice. Same exact game, 2 different places. So yeah, very useful tool. Now there's also a bunch of other different settings for this, or basically supplemental tools. One is the sort of region tool. This means that you can sort of select a certain area and say like, I only want that to get copied or not copied, whichever you want. And so now if we actually go to the copy and paste tool, we really stamp that in. You can see that it's only really stamping the, well, let's do it in a new place because it's even more obvious. is only going to be stamping in. Let's change this so that it's only going to stamp it here, for instance. Maybe here. So we only want that area that's in the sort of brush, the mask, to get affected. So let's do that. And if we stamp it as hard as we like, we go crazy with the stamping, but only the area in that mask has been affected by it. So it's very useful if you just want, you know, to only affect within whatever you paint down in that region. So you can see there, that mask nicely masked out the area that I was stamping in. So that could be very useful. Of course, these are sort of very, very general purpose tools, so I don't know exactly what you're going to be using them for. It's just good to know that that is there in case you need it. And then, of course, the other one is mirroring the entire terrain. Now, this I don't really use very often at all, but yeah, it basically lets you decide where you're going to have a sort of center point, and then you can apply a complete mirror operation to the entire landscape. So, I mean, I don't know exactly when you'll be using that, but it is possible to do that. So now we have four sets of stone circles on our landscape now, which is kind of nifty. But yeah, that's there if you want it. You can also change, of course, all of the different symmetry settings. X to Y, Y to Y, Y plus to Y minus. You can rotate. So now it's actually a rotation. It's not a mirror. But yeah. And there's the smoothing width, which I presume is the sort of width that it smooths across the middle. But yeah. And of course you can change the point there with X and Y, or just X actually. But yeah, you can change the point with this little handle, or in the tool itself right there. So yeah, that's a basic overview of all of the sort of basic Unreal Engine landscape sculpting tools. Yeah, so pretty much the only other thing that I think is really important that you know about is the landmass plugin. So landmass is a newly introduced feature in 4.24, which is an experimental set of landscape sculpting tools. So I think the first thing that you should probably do is start to get really, really comfortable with the tools that are in here first. But be aware that there are sort of these newer procedural tools on the horizon that will be able to work with this exact terrain system. So if we go up to Edit and then Plugins, and we search for Landmass and hit Enable, it will say plugin landmass is a beta version and might be unstable or removed without notice. Please use with caution. Are you sure you want to enable the plugin? So now take this warning with great severity, because if you do start to use these tools and they at some point in the future become outdated and deprecated and replaced with something else that's sort of built into the engine, we don't really know at this stage what Epic Games are going to do with this. Probably they don't know either. This is sort of just like very sort of experimental. This is a sort of very experimental new feature that they're adding to the engine, which shows a great deal of promise. It's really, really cool. It's a great sort of procedural way of manipulating landscapes, and should work great with things like an auto material. So I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, be very, very cautious that if you're going to enable this plugin, that you really know that it could be that in the future that's not something you're going to be able to use, or that Epic will actually build it directly into the engine rather than by using a sort of plugin. But by all means, go in there and try out Landmass. There's a video from Epic, an hour-long sort of overview of Landmass, where the guys sort of explain all of the different applications for it, and how it's going to work with world composition, in order to create bigger levels. and to be able to sort of have a sort of more next generation approach to sculpting the landscape. And this includes things like paintable landscape layers. So you know how I'm creating my terrain here, and I'm making these sort of changes to the terrain. Well, the big issue with this is that it's actually a destructive workflow. So if I want to go back to the previous to any of my previous operations, whether it was where I'm putting down an alpha sculpting brush, whether I was stamping down or copying this sort of data here, there's no way that I can actually go back and sort of undo one of those things. If I go to my undo history, it will it'll either be wiped, but eventually, when I save and reload the editor or whatever, but there'll be no way that I can kind of go and say like, oh, remember that point where I sculpted down this brush here? Imagine if I could go back now and I could go to that layer and I could just change it a little bit. That's the power of landmass and sort of paint layers. So it's going to be really interesting, to sort of see what Epic Games can do with that, and if they can build that sort of functionality into the engine and make sort of landscape sculpting a little bit more like layers in Photoshop or something like that. And I think that's going to be something that in the future is going to be a super powerful workflow change. So yeah, super excited about landmass. Definitely go and check it out. I'll leave a link in the description below so you can watch the full landmass overview video. And I think that will make a nice sort of addition to this video. But yeah, the tools that I've gone over in this video are all things that are built into Unreal Engine natively right now. You can go and download Brushify, you can download Unreal, you can basically start sculpting and using these tools to build games right now. So yeah, a lot of the time I do get people sort of talking to me about the experimental stuff and sort of asking, when am I going to support that or this? And a lot of the time the answer is, I'm very, very, very careful about the experimental stuff that I support, because at the moment I'd rather just stick to supporting what is natively built into Unreal Engine and what people can actually use to build games. And that's just to be very, very cautious that if Epic in the future do decide they're not going to use a feature or they're going to deprecate something, that my entire infrastructure for Brushify, the auto material, all the levels, all of the lighting, all of the stuff that you get with it, is not somehow tied to some experimental feature that could just disappear one version to the next. So I just do, I do try and build everything solidly on the default platform that Epic have released. So yeah, I hope you guys really enjoyed this tutorial where I just went over, all of the different landscaping features. Obviously, to kind of cover these sort of topics in this comprehensive way, it takes a little bit of time, takes a bit of research. And I try to make these videos as comprehensive as possible. So I hope you guys appreciate that. And if this video is helpful to you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, visit www.brushify.io/bootcamp for more videos like this. And yeah, I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I'm just going to finish up by trying to jump on these things again and see if I can get all the way down. Ooh. See, I should do this kind of stuff more often, just weird little gameplay. Oh my god, I'm terrible at this. That's also a great thing. You can test out your levels with, first person, third person, driving simulations, airplane simulations, and so on. Woohoo! I made it. And yeah, it's really fun just to be able to sort of, alter everything in real time and just see the awesome results of your level right then and there. So, thanks guys. It's been great. Cheers. Bye-bye.